And we're live. All right. So good afternoon and welcome. This is the second in this fall's series of webinars on grazing. My name is Carolyn Wong. I'm your grazing land management specialist. And today we're going to talk a little bit about grazing animals. Last time we were together, we talked about forages. Today's presentation is going to mostly be review or introduction to just some basic fundamentals of grazing animals. If you're going to be working with livestock producers, there's some basic concepts and terminology that I want to make sure everyone's aware of. And some of what we'll get introduced today will also factor into the later series as we get into more of the details of conservation planning on grazing. So with that, let's get to it. All right, so to start with, we are going to just have a very general overview of pasture-based livestock production in the PIA.
I'm on right now.
Hi.
I am.
Hello. We're going to go over a basic introduction to pasture-based livestock production. And just so you know, for the most part with our grazing ruminants, we don't have many feedlots left in Hawaii. There are a few smaller ones, maybe small scale, and there's some feeding that happens at slaughter facilities, but for the most part, our livestock industry in Hawaii is all pasture-based. And I believe that mostly translates out into the West as well. We're going to go over some of the basics of herbivore anatomy and physiology, specifically herbivores that live on grazing lands. We're going to talk about some of the elements of livestock nutrition, and then we're going to wrap up with introducing the concept of animal units. Okay. So generally, again, most operations in PIA are beef cattle operations. There are some folks that are doing dairy, sheep, goats, horses. Some people are raising animals for fiber. And then we're seeing some of the kind of new niche trends of pasture-based pigs and chickens, and then also seems like more and more alpacas are showing up on the radar, mostly for fiber again. And with the exception of fiber and dairy operations, most of these operations are producing a weaned animal for market, a calf, a kid, or a lamb. There are a few seed stock producers in the state that I'm aware of. Seed stock producers are basically raising animals for breeding. They sometimes have registered herds, for example. And then there are folks doing grass finishing with cattle, sheep and goats. There's operations that are raising their animals primarily for fiber. Not many, but there are a few. And it's important to understand what your producer's market is, because it's going to affect his goals and objectives, and it's going to affect the way that he needs to manage his animals, and that's in turn going to or can affect his grazing management and the decisions he can make related to that. All right, so in these weaned animal systems, we usually have a few different groups of animals. We can have, I should say. There's the herd of mother animals. Then there's the males for breeding. There needs to be some method for replacing mother animals as they get older, and they need to be replaced with a new young female. And then there are the weaned animals, calves, lambs, and kids. Depending on the operator, some people manage these all as separate herds. Some people don't. Some people have just a few of these herds. And so it's just really important as you're working with a producer to understand what he's trying to do and what his management is comprised of for his livestock. All right, and so the reproductive females usually make up the bulk of a livestock operation, except maybe fiber operations. And you don't need to be an animal expert, but having an awareness of this information will help you to work more effectively with livestock producers. So specifically, understanding that with the different types of animals, they come to a reproductive maturity at different ages. For cattle, that's usually between 18 and 24 months. That's usually a good breeding window. For sheep and goats, their good breeding window is usually 12 to 18 months, but they're actually physiologically capable of reproducing earlier. It's not always desirable for them to be bred at an especially young age. You end up with a lot of complications. But it's up to the producer to decide this element of what age they would like to begin breeding at. And then it's also important to be aware that reproductive females, they typically have a effective breeding lifespan. For cattle, with most of our operations around here, they usually are in the herd for around 10 years. For sheep and goats, it can be often 7 to 8 years. It can all vary totally depending on the producer, their genetics, the nutrition that they have their animals on, and their management style and their decisions. But just so you have a vague awareness, this is what it could look like. Gestation, the amount of time it takes from conception to birth, is for cattle about 9.5 months, and for sheep and goats roughly about 5 months. And then for the males in the group, in the herd, they're a pretty important element. They can have a really big influence on the operation because they bring 50% of the genetic base to the herd. Oftentimes, producers will make significant investments in their males because they are so influential on the future genetic makeup of the herd. It's also important to understand that a livestock operation should be aiming for a optimal male to female ratio in order to ensure optimal production, and you also don't want too many males out there because if you have more than you need, that's forage that could be supporting a reproductive female, and then you also have the social issues. This table comes out of our National Range and Pasture Handbook. It gives you an idea on some of what textbooks at least recommend for appropriate male to female ratios for different groups, different types of animals. Also gives you an idea of the heat period. You know, it can be a pretty small window that male has to be able to service that female in order to have her conceive, and then it'll be a considerable amount of time. That heat cycle is the amount of time it is going to be before that female should cycle again and come into heat again and be able to conceive. Okay, a little more on the males. Their libido, okay, their mojo, their affects their serviceability. Males are or should be kept as long as they're able to fulfill their purpose. And in order for them to be successful at servicing the herd, they've got to be strong and vigorous. It's important that they are not lame and that all their parts are working. In herds with more than one male, you'll see this pecking order establishment. They will often fight in order to establish their hierarchy. And so, again, it's usually good practice for livestock producers that they're trying to get at the proper number of males in their operation. And, you know, for us, when working with livestock producers, again, we're not animal production experts, but it's important to recognize the different animal classes, what their purposes are, what their needs are, what their lifespans look like, and what their habits are. Because with this perspective, we're better able to try to understand some of the considerations that producers are going to have when they're making decisions related to their herd and their grazing management systems. Okay, so for grass finishing and dairy operations, they're typically going to have some different priorities. Their herd composition and harvest schedules or milking rotations, they're going to vary a lot from producer to producer. Their nutritional needs are going to be really different from a cow-calf or lamb or goat producer, and their operations are usually going to be more concerned with things like pasture quality or forage quality, low-stress environments, age of their herd or females. Their breed selection is going to matter because not all breeds are going to perform the same in different environments and on different grasses or forages. And often with these types of operations, you usually see a little bit of a more intensive grazing management system if they're pasture-based. And, oh, here's a term to be aware of. ADG is average daily gain, and producers with grass finishing operations or dairies may be concerned with this. All of these things, pasture quality, low stress environments, etc., all have the potential to affect that number that gets calculated. So it's just a measure of performance. Okay, so we are about to get into the next section, but before we do, let's have a quick quiz. It was well received last time, so it's helpful for a little bit of review. All right, so for your first question, it's a short answer. I thought I'd try this time. What does it mean to be cow-calf? Sorry, Wally, I just saw your message. And are you on? Or maybe not Wally Kavika?
Was that supposed to be multiple choice?
No, it's not multiple choice. It's for you to just give a simple, short answer of what it means for a producer to be a cow-calf producer.
Excuse me, Carolyn.
Yes. Hi, Pam.
Hi, do you have the link to your presentation? The previous one's not allowing me to enter or view your presentation.
Today's?
Yeah.
Oh.
Carolyn, I can try forwarding mine to her.
Would you please,
Sure.
Tony?
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Thank you.
Yeah, Pam, you didn't get the notice earlier today?
It
came in a...
I don't have anything from you today.
It came in a calendar invite, a calendar meeting invite.
Nada.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No worries. Yeah.
Okay, Pam, Tony here. I just sent it to you.
Thank you.
Okay, I got about 4 answers come in so far. Just give it a crack. This is a real common term that's important you understand. Good, I see some good answers coming in. Yeah, a producer will generally describe themselves as cow-calf. When they say that, they're saying, I'm a cow-calf producer, and basically, I raise cows in order to sell their calves. I produce calves for my market, and that's usually how it is. They may sell their cull cows, of course, but their main objective for their market is to sell calves. So good. Some very good answers in there. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go to the next question. So what's the big deal about a bull? Why are bulls so special? You can choose 2 answers for this one. And I guess depending on who you're asking, you could get different answers. I've never ridden one, but my son's addicted, so I guess they're fun. But the 2 answers we're looking for are they have a big influence on herd genetics, and they often represent a considerable investment to a rancher. Very good. Okay, I'm going to go to the next question. What's important for a grass finisher? What are some of the elements that I mentioned that are going to matter to a person producing grass finish animals? Very good. Yeah, it's really all of these: forage quality or pasture quality, keeping those animals under low stress, watching their age, at which they're going to be finished, and the breed of their animal are all going to matter considerably for a serious grass finisher. Very good. Okay, I'm going to put these away. And the last question for this section: what's the minimum number of herds a producer should have? Some of you might be like, wait, she didn't talk about that, but think about it. I guess if you're thinking about, like many of you are probably in eligibility mode, yeah, I guess when it comes to equip, producers should at least have one herd. But really, it depends on the producer's objectives. They may have just one herd, they may have more than one, they may have several, and that's going to totally depend on what they're about, what they're producing, and what their herd's needs are. So very good. Let's keep going. I'm going to hide this. Okay. Pam, were you able to get onto the PowerPoint?
Yes.
All right, awesome. I'm sorry again that you didn't get that original email. I'll double check the list and make sure you're on it. Okay.
Carol, could you send it to me because I don't have the link either?
Oh man,
This is Jocelyn.
I'll send it to you, Joss.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm so sorry, guys. Thank goodness we're recording. Okay, it's okay. We're just getting to the good stuff. Now we're going to touch on some of the main ideas for grazing land, herbivore, anatomy, and physiology. Remember, digestion begins with the bite. It goes from, the whole digestive system is considered the mouth all the way to the end of the tract where it comes out the back end. It's both a physical and a chemical process, and grazing animals are typically grouped loosely into these two groups. There's ruminant digestion and there's monogastric digestion. There are some real specialized modified ruminants, but we're not going to get into that today. We're just going to talk about these two main groups and their differences. So this slide is a good summary of some of the main differences between the groups. So ruminants have a 4-chambered stomach. Their absorption function is within their last stomach mostly, and they're very highly dependent on these microorganisms to break down their food within their stomach, within their rumen and their reticulum. Monogastrics, on the other hand, they have a one-chamber stomach. Their system mostly digests simple carbohydrates. They tend to be pretty efficient users of feed, and all of their energy comes from foodstuffs. In the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about this. All right, so there's actually a ton of differences between ruminants and monogastrics, and this could be taught, in semester-long college courses. The intention for today is focus on some of the main differences. So with ruminants, like we said, there's 4 stomachs. The key thing is understanding that because they have a rumen, they have this huge population of ruminant microorganisms, and that enables them to effectively digest cellulose and lignin, like we talked about last time, the things that make up fiber in addition with hemicellulose. These ruminant microorganisms also enable them to improve the quality of the protein in their diet. Because they are ruminants, they have to ruminate on the feed after grazing. We're going to get to a slide that's going to talk a little more about that. Some of the energy in the feed is lost when it was through methane production. Ruminants can be subject to bloat, which can be fatal if it's not managed properly. And with ruminants, because they have this rumen and it stores all this forage, it can take 6 or 7 hours for them to harvest the amount of feed that they need to meet their daily requirements from a good quality pasture. Monogastrics, on the other hand, they're built very differently, and their systems are much more efficient. They pretty much get all their vitamins and proteins directly from the source of their food. They don't have microorganisms that are creating them. The ruminant microorganisms have the ability to restructure some of the amino acids into proteins, and they are a protein source themselves, as well as they are able to synthesize some vitamins. So that's the difference. With monogastrics, though, it all has to come from the food. They also depend highly on the enzymes in their stomachs for breaking down the food, and they don't ruminate, so they don't keep chewing it to break it up. They have to just it all happens chemically. And then most of their energy is released right into the bloodstream, and they are able to eat their daily feed requirements a lot more quickly because it's processed more efficiently in their body. Okay. So here's a better picture of a close-up of the anatomy and physiology of a ruminant. It's super simplified, but it'll work for our purposes today. We're just trying to hit the high points. So some of the different parts, right? So from the mouth, after the food is chewed, it gets swallowed, goes down the esophagus, reaches the rumen. It stays in the rumen where it can be regurgitated for more chewing action, and then swallowed again. And in that rumen and reticulum is where all this ruminal microorganism action is happening. There's fermentation going on. Those microorganisms are working on getting at those plant cells and breaking down the lignin and the cellulose. This is where a lot of carbohydrate and protein digestion occurs, and where some of that protein synthesis that I was talking about occurs. The reticulum works together with the rumen in order to provide that fermentation and kind of functions as a screen. Only once the forages are digested to a small enough form can it pass the reticulum and get into the omasum. In the omasum, the material is squeezed and all the liquid portions they come out. And then the food passes to the abomasum, which is more like a true stomach, like our stomach. That's where the gastric juices are added to the forage and aid with the chemical digestion. The small intestine is where a lot of absorption of nutrients happens. The large intestine takes out even more of the water, and then it's on its way out of the body. Some examples of ruminants that we would work with would be cattle, sheep, goats, and deer. Okay, monogastrics, on the other hand, they have a mouth, they chew their food. That saliva helps to begin the process of that food breakdown. It passes through that esophagus to the stomach. The stomach is used to store food and, again, releases those gastric juices. They just have that one single true stomach. Those gastric juices help to digest the food. It's similar to the abomasum in a ruminant. There's in the small intestine, food is further broken down into simple components, and then those compounds are absorbed. The big difference now, if you notice, we have this big thing called a cecum. And a cecum is where there's some, monogastrics are also referred to as hindgut fermenters, because these cecums are another big fermentation vat, basically. In the cecum, there's microorganisms that break down any leftover proteins and provide for some fermentation of fibers and absorption of nutrients. It doesn't function the same as a rumen, so don't get it confused. Just be aware that monogastrics have cecums. That's what makes them a hindgut fermenter, and it does allow for them to kind of get one more chance to take out some of the good stuff that's in the forage. Then we pass into the large intestine, where more of the water is removed, and then it's waiting to be excreted. Some examples of monogastrics are horses, donkeys, and rabbits. And a lot of omnivores, obviously omnivores are all monogastric also, including us, pigs, dogs, and rats. Not everybody has a huge cecum like this horse. It's going to be very different from animal to animal, but this was a good picture to kind of illustrate the concept. And that's all I'm going to attempt to teach on for ruminant and monogastric digestion. It was a review for myself as well. And like I said, there's semester-long courses and people way, way more qualified to teach on that. But just try to get at some of the fundamentals for you. And so you'll be familiar with some of these terms, and especially as we talk about them later. So what are the two types of herbivore digestive systems? There were two different ways you could refer to them. I kind of gave the answer away with that, I suppose. Yeah, you guys had such an easy time with the questions last time. I tried to make them a little more challenging. A little trickier. They're mostly referred to as ruminants and monogastrics, but you will see them referred in literature and in academia and other things. You also see them referred to as foregut and hindgut fermenters. So just be aware that they're both talking about the same thing. Ruminants are foregut fermenters because they have a rumen, and that fermentation is happening before their main stomach. And monogastrics are referred to as hindgut fermenters because they have that cecum, and that fermentation process happens after their true stomach, okay? Very good. Go to the next question. Okay, true or false? Ruminants are better at digesting fiber. Yes, the correct answer is true. They are better at digesting fiber because they have this gigantic rumen with tons of ruminant microorganisms that can help them break it down. Very good. Oh, wait a minute. This is numbered wrong. My bad. Sorry about that. One more, true or false. True or false? Monogastrics have 4 stomachs. That was the easy one. Right. Monogastrics have 1 stomach, referring to all those animals that are not ruminants, including us. Thank you. Okay, we are gonna keep going. Unless does anyone have any burning questions they want to ask right now before we keep going forward?
We have a question.
Yeah.
If horses and cattle are kind of kept in the same pasture and eating kind of a similar diet, but their digestion is so different, I mean, do their diets vary, or are they eating pretty much the same thing?
That's a great question, Laura. I was gonna mention diet selection in a later slide. They have different grazing habits, and we're not going to get into the details of that today. I had started this PowerPoint, and I was up to like 60 slides going into some of the really cool science behind what the different diet selections choices are, preferences are, how animals learn to use different forages and stuff. And I was like, you know what, girl, you're going way too far, way too fast. So I pulled all those out, and I've saved them for maybe a future one. If there's enough interest, I'd be happy to share some of the stuff that I've learned and some of the educational resources that are out there that get to exactly that question. They do have some differences in diet selection, and their ability to process that forage is different, and so their performance is going to be different on it. Let's keep going. I'm going to touch a little bit on some of those differences here, and then if you like, we can talk about it a little bit more in detail later, or I'll probably run a poll later and see, poll the field offices and see how much of an interest there is in that more advanced kind of topic. Thanks for your question. Anybody else have any questions? Okay, let's keep going then, and then Laura, you let me know if you want to talk about it later today.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So for livestock nutrition, again, I'm not a total expert on this, but for our purposes, we don't actually need expert understanding, but pretty basic fundamental level. So when animals take in forage, the energy that's in that forage basically goes to one of two places. It goes to maintenance for maintaining body functions like respiration, blood flow, nervous system functions, or it goes to production, meat or other products, milk or wool. Different kinds of animals and different breeds of animals have different nutritional requirements during the year. Totally depends on a lot of factors. We're going to go into that right now. And they have the ability to acquire different values from their forages or their supplements, just depending on how they're built, what kind of animal they are. So when we're talking about livestock nutrition, we're talking about energy. And energy functions and paths in livestock nutrition can get super technical and complicated. But for today, we're just going to focus on some of the factors that affect basal metabolism, okay? That term is basically referring to the maintenance cost of an animal, with the things that they need just to keep their bodies functioning and alive. And the factors that also affect its concept of voluntary intake. Okay, so for these 4 sections, we're going to go into in a little bit more detail. And just so you know, all this stuff comes out of our National Range and Pasture Handbook. I'm teaching mostly from that, making sure I cover the concepts in there, and I'm adding a little bit of stuff that's more, that I've found is very relevant to our work out here. So some of the physical factors that can affect this maintenance cost of a particular animal and the associated voluntary intake are things like the breed of an animal, its age, its sex, and its body condition score. So younger animals, basically they generally kind of are running at a little bit of a higher rate. Older animals, their basal metabolism is kind of slowing down. Not that different from us if you think about it. Yeah, little kids running around all the time, their energy level is really high, they're burning, they're metabolizing a lot all day long. And as we get older, you'll see adults, even their diet needs really reduce. They start to eat less because they're running at a whole different speed. They're in another gear. The sex of an animal, an intact male generally has a higher metabolism or maintenance cost than a non-pregnant female and then a castrated male. I didn't include pregnant females in there because they're kind of in the production mode. The body condition score of an animal allows producers to evaluate animals with a scoring system that kind of reflects their reproductive performance, and it's a good measure of their nutritional state. It's best used at calving time, and the percentage of body fat in livestock at different stages of the production cycle is important because it helps to determine their reproductive performance and their overall productivity. So some of the different factors that can affect body condition scores can be climatic conditions, the stage of production that they're in. Ideally, like it says, you're using this at calving, but the age of an animal is going to affect her body, can affect her body condition score, the animal's genetics, the calving date, the weaning date, and their forage management. That's directly related to their nutrition. And if you look at this chart, the relationship between body condition score and pregnancy percentage. You know, body condition score is considered a really good indicator of performance when it comes to pregnancy rates. This graph demonstrates that, you know, pregnancy rates start to drop off pretty significantly when you go from a body condition score of 5 down to a body condition score of a 4. And it tends to be more optimal or better if you're within the range of a 5 to a 7. Cows that are thin following calving have a longer period between that calving time and when they are able to put their condition back on is how they describe it, or they recover in order to rebreed successfully, compared to a cow that is adequately conditioned when she calves. And the impact on pregnancy rate of a thin body condition at calving is pretty negative unless the rancher can afford to give the time that that animal might need to recover her condition. Okay, a little bit more on body condition score. So this diagram of the cow kind of shows some of the different reference points that are going to be listed in this list. Again, you're not expected to be able to score animals, but just be aware that their condition is going to be very important to the producer because it's going to be a reflection of his herd's potential productivity in the next season. And their condition is related to a lot of things, but one of the biggest things is their forage quality, which is related to their grazing management. So the nutritional needs required to meet performance or calving rates they're influenced by these initial body reserves of this protein and fat. So body condition scoring is a guide that we use to evaluate that nutritional status. The rating is a more reliable guide than live weights, or because of, live weights can mistakenly be used as an indication of body condition, but it's not the best because it can be influenced by the fill level of the gut or some of the different products of pregnancy, right? Like, the fact that they're lactating. And so it's not the best indicator of condition. Body condition scores are numbers that suggest the relative fatness or body composition of the animal. The scores for cattle range from 1 to 9, for cattle and horses, and for sheep and goats it ranges from 1 to 5. A body condition score of a 5 or more indicates at least 14% body weight in a cow. And if she's there at calving and through breeding, then she's recommended for good reproductive performance. She's expected to perform well. For first calf heifers, you generally want them to be in a little bit higher than a 5, maybe like a 5.5 to 6, in order to compensate for the energy she's still needing to grow out to her mature size. So the take-home message: the condition of the animal affects performance in a cow, and performance in a cow means successful conception, calving, and weaning. And body condition score is a term that you should be familiar with and be able to know what you're looking at. If you're looking at a herd of skinny cows, or if you're looking at a herd of real nice, fat, shiny cows, and they've all got big calves at their side, that's an indicator of something. And so these terms are meant to help introduce you to that. Here's some examples of cows in different body condition scores. I got all of these off of a extension publication out of Virginia State University. So you can see how they progressively get in better condition as they move from a 1 to a 2 to a 3. And then even better, they go up the lines from a 4 to a 5 to a 6. So from 5 to 6 to 7, kind of where they tend to have the most optimal reproductive potential. They go too big to an 8 and a 9, their reproductive success rates start to drop off again. So producers generally don't want super fat cows, but nice, healthy, toned cows that aren't too skinny. Okay, so physiological state. Physiological state can affect the maintenance costs and the voluntary intake because, well, pregnant animals, for example, they have a greater appetite and they spend more time grazing and searching for food than non-pregnant animals. Their energy needs are during their pregnancy is most critical during the last third of the term. And nutritional deficiencies in a pregnant mom, especially protein deficiencies, they're going to first affect the mother, not the newborn. And if it's affecting her and she's coming into calving skinnier, it's going to set her back from when she'll be able to be rebred successfully. The health and vigor of the calf can be affected, of course, if it's really severe. Maintenance requirements of livestock are also increased by activity. Cows that are required to graze over, wider areas or on steeper slopes, generally it takes a lot more energy to get there, so they require additional energy just to meet their maintenance requirements. So we need to be conscientious of that when we're working with producers. The cost is also higher for larger animals than for smaller animals. I found it fascinating that animals that are walking up really steep slopes actually will spend 12 to 20 times more energy than those that are on slopes of less than 15%. And up here in Waimea, we've got some really steep pools. Just found it really fascinating that it was at that large of a difference. Then, of course, working animals also have an increased demand. If you think about it, for us, the more active we are, if we exercise or play sports, our metabolism goes up. We know that from human nutrition. So the same kind of concepts transfer over to animals. And then same with us when we are, for us females at least, if we're lactating, we also have a higher nutritional need. And for livestock, it's the second greatest source of nutritional stress, followed by, or the only thing that's higher is really, really heavy muscular activity or work. If you're like oxen or working horses, they have even more nutritional stress. But A lactating mom has a lot of stress on her. Milk is 80 to 88% water, so water is a really crucial nutrient to maintain during lactation, but all their nutrient needs are increased. And in cows, peak lactation generally occurs in mature animals around 30 to 45 days following parturition, and then it gradually tapers off. And this is why the peak demands for nutrients follow the typical milk flow characteristics. When a herd has dropped all their babies and all those mamas are in the first month and a half of carrying those babies, their nutritional demand is the highest because they're not only trying to feed themselves and respond or rebound after birth, they're also still providing most of the nutritional demand for that animal that's now outside of them but is growing, and that animal hasn't started eating its own forage generally. They're mouthing things and taking little bites, but they're depending all on the mom. So her nutritional stress is the highest when she's got a relatively newborn, and up to that kid or lamb or calf is about a month and a half old, sorry. Okay, other environmental factors that can affect an animal's maintenance level is this concept of a thermal neutral zone. Just know that temperatures affect the animal's maintenance level. It does because they're using more energy in order to either try to keep warm or cool off. So low temperatures, if it's really wet and cold and muddy, can decrease intake, and they're shivering more and they're losing more energy, so you can see their conditions start to drop. Dry, cold conditions, not so much. In fact, they have demonstrated that they actually start to try to eat more. But here in Hawaii and in the Pacific, what we should more maybe be considered with is the effect of higher temperatures. If the nights are cooler, grazing animals, if it's really hot in the daytime, they'll shift to more of their grazing activity in the nighttime. And if it's just too hot, they just really slow down. They don't even eat. The typical thermoneutral zones are listed there. I guess the main point that I wanted to make is that, just be conscientious that shade and the ability for animals to regulate their body temperature is important to the animals for their performance and production, and so it'll be important. It may be important to a producer as well. They will know better than we will whether or not it's an issue for them, but it's something to be aware of, and again, be familiar with these terms. This picture, I don't know if you can make it out very well, but I thought it was crazy because this morning that I was out on this pasture, the cows had laid down all in the shadow of this windmill. We can just make it out. This little group had, they were kind of going into their ruminating phase for the morning, and they were all seeking out whatever shade they could find, and there were actually quite a few of them in this shadow. I just couldn't get a really good picture of it, but I thought that was fun. All right, forage quality. You guys recognize this slide? Quality has probably the greatest influence on intake, because as quality declines, their intake declines, because the higher the fiber, the lower the digestibility. And if the digestibility is lower, then their voluntary intake is going to go down. And that's because, if you think about it, they're eating this forage, but if it's super stemmy and really fibery, it's staying in their rumen a longer time. They have to chew it up as good as they can, swallow it the first time, chew it again, ruminate on it again, swallow it again, and those microorganisms really have to work in overtime because they've got a lot of lignin and cellulose and hemicellulose to try to break down in order to get at the cell solubles that are inside, right? The energy and the protein that we learned about last time. So if the quality is really low because the fiber is too high, then their intake is going to go down because they just don't have, they can't move it through their bodies fast enough, okay, in a nutshell. That's kind of how it works. All right, so this graph shows the relative amount of available forage and quality that has to be presented to different kinds and classes of livestock in order to achieve their production objectives. We should realize that within a pasture or stand of forage, and even within a grazing period, you can really be anywhere on this plot as it relates to the amount of forage and its relative quality. In a high quality pasture that's really well recovered, you can be way up here on the upper right as far as quality and quantity is concerned. And you can stay there for the first couple of days, but as that grass is grazed down, then less leaf is available, and it's becoming more stemmy. And now quality is declining, and the amount of available forage is also going down. And it's important to understand the livestock's nutritional needs and what that pasture can offer when we're working on grazing lands. Like we were just discussing, different animals have different energy requirements, and so that's why, yeah, I thought this graph was pretty cool, where it kind of plotted that out and kind of matched it with the type of animals that need these different combinations of quality and quantity to be at their optimal performance. And this picture came from same pasture. Some of the kikuyu grass was in this really nice, vigorous form. It was producing lots of leaf. It had a lot of really good digestible material, and some of it was just like this, just stunted and not really growing. And these are things that we need to be queuing in on and identifying and considering when we're starting to inventory the pasture for forage production. Okay, that section is over. Go to one more quick quiz. Okay, so we talked a lot about basal metabolism, that general maintenance cost. What are some of the factors that affect that basal metabolism? Good, right. The physical factors, the physiological state, the environment, and forage quality all have an impact on the basal metabolism of an animal. Very good. Everybody got that. We talked about energy. Animals need energy for what mostly? Very good, right. Maintenance and production. Not that different from us. Okay, next question. True or false? All animals' energy needs are pretty much the same. Right, false. Remember that plot we just showed? Some animals really need high quality, lots of it, in order to really be at their optimum. And some animals can afford to eat stuff that's a little bit lower quality because their maintenance costs are lower, right? And or they may not be in as much of a productive mode. Very good. Okay, another true or false. Body condition score is a good indicator of nutritional status of an animal. Awesome. True. Yes. Body condition score is a very good indicator of nutritional status, which affects production, right? Which affects performance. So very good.
Hey, Carolyn, our polls are taking like a little while to show up. Like ours just showed up, so.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay,
No,
I'll go a
no
little
problem.
slower.
Thank you.
Thanks for letting me know. Okay, and I think this is the last question. What effect will high fiber forages have on voluntary intake? Right, most of you got that. So high fiber forages can have the effect of reducing intake because it's so fibrous. There's so much for those microorganisms to break down in the rumen that it takes longer. And so if that rumen is full of a high fiber forage, they can't go out and keep packing it in. They need time for that material to move out of the rumen through the reticulum into the omasum and keep moving through that animal in order that she can graze some more. If her rumen is full, she can't keep grazing, so her voluntary intake may decline. And if her voluntary intake declines and she's eating high fiber stuff that doesn't have everything, all the nutrients and stuff that she needs for her nutritional demand, you can also expect to see her conditions going to drop. So if we're working with grazers, we want to have a general understanding of how different grazing management decisions might impact their herd's performance, because that's going to really matter to them. And we're not always going to be experts, but again, having a vague understanding, at least general, something to start from, because as you work with them, you're going to find you're going to want to know more, you're going to want to read more, you're going to maybe go to workshops and go to different clinics and stuff in order to learn more, and just keep building on this understanding in order to make you even better and better planner. It's a lot. There's so much to learn. We're not even hitting the tip of the iceberg with this webinar. It's really pathetic if we were measuring it in that way. But just to give you an introduction to some of the general terms and concepts, that's all we're able to do today. But there's so much more to all of this. Okay, so our last section is here on the animal unit. If you've been working with us for a while, you've probably heard of animal units already. The animal unit is basically a convenient denominator for using when calculating relative grazing impact of different kinds and classes of domestic livestock and common wildlife species. It's also, or for representing an amount of forage. An animal unit is generally one mature cow of approximately 1,000 pounds and a calf as old as 6 months, or their equivalent. An animal unit month, therefore, is the amount of forage required by an animal for 1 month. The NRCS, we've elected to use 26 pounds of oven dry weight or 30 pounds of air dry weight, or as fed of forage per day as a standard forage demand for one animal unit, or a 1,000-pound cow with a calf. This consumption rate is equal to 2.6% of the body weight for oven dry, or 3% if we're talking air dry. And as we just discussed, forage consumption is affected by many factors, and it varies with the individual animal. Some of these factors can include, like we just said, forage quality, amount of crude protein and digestibility of that forage, the age of the animal, whether or not there's supplementation being provided, what kind of topography the animals are having to go across, the animal breed, the physiological state that the animal's in, what the weather factors are like. Remember, we talked about the thermoneutral zone. Other places in the country, they deal with snow, and that can have an impact. And the presence of watering facilities. Those are all important when we start thinking about the actual amount of forage animals are going to consume. It's a lot of different factors. This table comes right out of our National Range and Pasture Handbook, and it's a good guide for different animal unit equivalents if we're talking about different animals or classes of animals. And then it conveniently does the math for you and is figuring out the pounds that each animal would need for a day, a month, or a year. But it is using the oven dry conversion, not the air dry conversion. So later when we start talking about forage animal balance and stuff, it's important to be aware of what value you're using. Okay, and so understanding what an animal unit is and being able to speak in animal units is important in our work with producers. It's also an important concept that we need to get our heads around as we begin talking about forage animal balances, which we're going to get into in a future webinar. But basically, a forage animal balance is making sure that the stocking rate is balanced with the site's productive capability, supply and demand. It can be quite tricky depending on the complexity of the animal operation or the site And when you factor in all the things that can affect or an animal or herd's nutritional needs and intake, and add to that the unpredictability of weather and variation and stuff, it really it really gives you an appreciation for the art of grazing management. When it comes to grazing management, so much of it is art. I mean, it references a lot of science. It definitely helps to understand the science, but there's so many variables and so many factors that can depend on so many different things. It takes some time to really learn and get used to the concepts and what's going on in the ecology and stuff. And I'm here to do my best to try to help you if you're still learning. And then we're trying to develop tools, you know, always to try to make it easier or more efficient for trying to get at stuff like this, a forage-animal balance, and trying to help a producer figure out what's a decent stocking rate, a conservative stocking rate, or whether, you know, confirming whether her stocking rate might be a little bit high or not. But there's so much more that goes into it. This is really just touching the surface. In summary, well, maybe before we do that, let's go and finish the last quiz. I'm sorry. And then we'll wrap up after that. But we got one last quiz and then just a few questions. And then I got that summary slide, and then I have a quick evaluation question. Okay, so one animal unit. An animal unit is, what's the best way to finish with the options you're presented with? Right. So an animal unit can represent any kind of grazing animal, and it just depends on their animal unit equivalent. So when you're talking in animal units, at some point you have to talk about what kind of animal you're talking about, right? Okay. An animal unit is based on this one you should know at the drop of a hat. It's a 1,000-pound cow and calf. That's what our definition of an animal unit is based on. Very good. Everybody got that? True or false? NRCS uses 2.6% body weight of air-dried feed for one animal unit day. This is probably the trickiest question I stuck in there. The correct answer is false, because it's 2.6% of oven-dried feed. For air-dried feed, it's more like 3%. And I'll bring it up again when we start getting into forage inventories and stuff. But again, it's just important to be specific about what you're using, especially relative to how you are estimating forage production. If you're using air dry values or if you're using oven dry values, it's going to matter, and it'll affect your forage animal balance. Okay, so just be aware. All right, last question in this quiz. The actual amount of forage consumed depends on the easy one. All this and more. Forage quality, the age of the animal, its physiological state, the weather, water availability. Awesome. Okay, so that's the last of the quizzes. So quick recap then. In summary, some of the main take-home messages I was hoping to get across today is that as conservationists, it's really important that we have a good understanding of the producer's market objectives as it relates to grazing management. It's also important to understand basically the animal physiology and the implications to forage quality, okay, that relationship. Good to understand that livestock nutritional needs are going to vary depending on all kinds of things. It's why it's important when we're doing our inventory process to really try to understand what the livestock operator is doing and what kind of animals he has in his group. Not down to the most, minute detail, but we've got to know how much replacement heifers he keeps, how many cows he has, whether he's grass finishing anything, or we got to understand what are the different. He can't just tell you, oh, I get 60 head. Okay, what does that 60 head represent? Sometimes they say 60 head, they're talking about cows and calves. So we got to know what he means, he or she means. Another main point is, the ability for livestock to meet their nutritional needs affects their performance, and animal units is a term that we use to reference forage demand across species. As I kind of hinted at earlier, there's so much more we could talk about related to animal behavior, definitely diet selection, and grazing behavior. And I would love to talk about some of these more advanced topics in the future, the ones that I feel qualified to talk about. I got some really great educational resources from the BEHAVE program at Utah State, where I did my graduate degree, and some of the science that have come out of that department and others in that area related to how animals learn and how their experience really influences not only the choices that they make, but even their ability sometimes to utilize certain landscapes. It's just fascinating, and I've seen lots of examples where I've kind of seen these concepts prove true in my work here on the Big Island. So I think they're really cool, and I think they're very relevant, and sometimes can help us understand, what animals are doing out there and why. And for those of you that want to spend a little more time and get a little more detail on some of this stuff, here's some of the recommended reading. I thought I'd start adding some of this kind of stuff. I've got a pretty good library here. And I'm trying to make sure that the offices across the state have pretty decent references when it comes to grazing stuff. Some of them are my personal books, like Grass Productivity is a book that I picked up a few years ago. But anyway, these and lots of other references would be really, really helpful if you are, finding that you're really interested in this and would like to know more. I'd really encourage you to read, and these are some great places to start. The Intensive Grazing Management book is actually pretty entertaining. Dr. Smith had quite a sense of humor, and he writes like, you can almost hear like a person talking, so that's a really good starter for anybody. So that's it for today. I didn't want to take up the whole 2 hours. Does anybody have any specific questions about anything that we covered today? It might seem really technical and, into the deep part of the science of animal science, and some parts of it kind of do reference some of that, but again, it's so that you can have that awareness level, and so that when we start talking about it in future webinars or training exercises, they aren't foreign concepts, and you at least have a basic understanding of the difference between a ruminant and a monogastric, for example, and some of the things that affect intake and performance. Okay, if there's no questions, I have one.
Carolyn, I have a quick comment, if I may.
Sure.
Yeah, Tony. So I just sent an update to Carl Micosta for our PIA web page to post all these recordings for you along with the slides. He said he was going to work on that today, but it'll be on the technical pages, and we'll send you out the link to that soon. But anyway, all the recordings for these things will be up on our PIA website fairly soon, hopefully by tomorrow, and I'll let you all know. And then, Carolyn, just take a look at my email. You can send your recordings and your slides directly to Carl, and he'll post them for us.
Sounds good. Thank you, Tony. That would be great.
Yeah.
Okay, I see a raised hand. Does someone else have a question? Waimea, did you raise your hand, or was it an accident? Okay. Po'olehua, you have a question?
Yeah, so you mentioned deer and you mentioned chicken. Is anybody doing range on any of these animals in the PIA right now?
I'm sorry, Wally, can you say that one more time?
Okay, so we talked about deer and
Yes.
we talked about chickens for range animals. I was wondering if anybody's doing that in the PIA area.
Pasture-raised chickens, I've fielded a few phone calls on it. It's usually really small scale. And for deer, it's certainly a concern for a few of our offices, yeah.
And the reason why I asked, because I have one producer that's doing deer, and there's another on Lanai, he's going to start doing chickens. And they were
Okay.
asking me how we can help them, and I was like, I'll get back to you. So I don't have an answer.
That was a good answer. I would love to talk with you about this maybe after. I got a question
Okay.
come in through the chat of going back to slide 31. I think this is the right slide. And the third point should be AUM. Oh, yeah, sorry, that's a typo. Thanks for catching that. This should be AUM. My bad. I switched these around and I forgot to change that. So, yeah, the amount of forage for one animal unit for 1 month would be an AUM, one animal unit month. Thanks, guys. Yeah, you know, Wally, when it comes to folks that have these other types of animals that a little more non-traditional on pasture, like chickens and pigs, a lot of the discussion nationally where it's going is that number one, it doesn't always really fit well with the prescribed grazing standard that's kind of agreed to more or less across the country. Some states are asking for a new practice for managing those kind of animals on grazing lands. And the other consensus is that, you know, it's going to depend on every state to kind of decide how they want to handle it programmatically. But as conservationists, we can still work with them to identify what resource concerns they have related to their soil, water, air, plants, and animals. A lot of our tools probably won't work very well, but, you know, we can still look at it. And if the chicken field is all bare ground, obviously we have a little bit of a soil erosion problem. From a technical standpoint, we can talk to them about some different ideas for how they might try to reestablish ground cover. And one of the main, you know, points that we should be able to say is that you probably have these animals on here either too frequently or too long, such that the forage can't handle it. And so, from a technical answer is that there should be some ways that we can at least give them some good technical advice. I'm not going to go near programmatic ramifications of it, but I think we should definitely take a look at what's going on out there and then look and see if there isn't any opportunities to help them. I found though that some of the guys that are getting into it more seriously, they've already done a lot of their homework and are trying to already kind of do it with the best information that's out there. So
Okay, thanks.
that helps. Yeah. All right, so interesting, the poll results, and this is what makes it so fun. About half of you, this was review, and about half of you, this was new. So I hope for the review folks that it was kind of helpful to kind of get a refresher, and for those of you that where it was new, don't be too overwhelmed. Just try to grasp the concepts, and then we're gonna build from this and start getting more into the grazing management area or focus starting next week, Tuesday. So if there's no other questions, I'm done. Thank you guys for your time. If there are any more questions, I'll stay on the line a little longer.
I got a quick question, Carolyn. It might be a
Sure.
little off topic or whatever, but is body conditioning score the same as frame score, or is that different?
The same as frame score, F-R-A-M-E?
Yeah.
I believe frame score refers more to the size of the animal, where body condition score is much more the nutritional status of the animal. Jill or someone that's got a lot more background, I know they use frames a lot for horses and cattle, but somebody especially with 4-H, Jill or Alex may be able to speak a little more to frame score. but that's my understanding of it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. It's not the same as body condition score, I'm fairly certain.
Hi, Carolyn, this is Jessica. I had a question about, so I know like you and I talked last week about the fact that a lot of times as you go up in elevation on these ranches, your fields have to get larger and larger because the forage isn't going to be at the same quality level as it is or amount as would be a lower level where, you know, you'd have more adequate rainfall and temperature and things like that. So once you get to these really large fields,